He looked me straight in the eyes, smiling like he had nothing to hide. That smile, it used to make me feel safe. It used to make me believe in him. But not anymore. Because deep down I knew. I knew the truth he had buried for years, the truth he thought I would never uncover. His laugh echoed through the room, casual, almost careless. Like nothing in the world was wrong. Like he hadn't built his entire life on lies. He poured himself another drink, leaned back in his chair, and talked about the future as though we shared one. And I nodded. I smiled. I played along. But inside, I was done. That night, I promised myself something. This would be the last time he ever fooled me. The very last time. You see, betrayal doesn't just happen in an instant. It's not a single moment, a single word, or a single lie. No, betrayal is slow. It grows like a shadow in the corner of a room, unnoticed at first, creeping, stretching, until suddenly it's everywhere. And when the light finally shines on it, you realize the shadow was there all along. That's how it felt with him. For years, I told myself the little things didn't matter. That the late nights, the missed calls, the half-truths were nothing. That if I just trusted him enough, if I just held on a little tighter, the cracks would somehow disappear. But cracks don't heal on their own. They spread. They grow. Until the whole thing collapses. And that's exactly what he never expected me to understand. So, while he laughed that night, as though his world was safe, as though his secrets were safe, I stayed quiet. Because my silence was more powerful than his lies. Because my silence was planning something he could never see coming. Revenge doesn't need noise. Revenge doesn't need shouting or anger or chaos. The sweetest revenge is calm. It's steady. It's patient. And when it comes, it leaves the other person speechless. I sat there, across from him, watching every move he made. The way his hands tapped the glass. The way his eyes darted for just a second too long when I asked a question. The way he covered it up with another smile. He thought I was blind. He thought I was naive. He thought I was the same person who used to believe every word he said. But I wasn't that person anymore. Not after what I'd found. Not after what I knew. And so, I laughed with him that night. But my laugh was different. Because hidden beneath it was a promise. That my revenge would not come today. Not tomorrow. Not when he expected it. It would come when he least suspected. And when it arrived, it would be silent, yet louder than anything he had ever faced. The kind of revenge that doesn't just destroy lies, it exposes them. The kind of revenge that doesn't just punish the guilty, it frees the betrayed. And as I sat there, listening to his voice, pretending to believe him one last time, I knew something he didn't. The countdown had already begun. When I first met him, he seemed like the kind of man people write about in novels. Charming, attentive, the type who noticed little details that others overlooked. If I mentioned I liked a certain song, it would be playing in his car the next time we drove together. If I casually spoke about a restaurant I'd always wanted to try, somehow we were there by the weekend. He made life feel effortless. Like he wasn't just a part of my story, but the missing piece that finally made everything make sense. In the beginning, he carried himself with a trustworthiness that was hard to resist. He spoke with conviction, like every word was coded in sincerity. And I, foolish, hopeful, maybe even a little desperate to believe in something good, let myself trust him. He wasn't just a partner. He was my safe place. Or at least, that's what I thought. Our days blended together in a rhythm that felt almost too perfect. Morning coffee, casual conversations, evenings spent watching shows we both pretended to care about. He laughed at my jokes, even the ones that weren't funny. He listened when I complained about work, nodding like every word mattered to him. And at night, when the world went quiet, he would hold me close. He'd whisper things like, "I'll always be here for you," and I wanted so badly to believe it. That was his gift. Not honesty. Not loyalty. But the ability to make his lies feel like promises. Looking back, I realize how carefully he built the illusion. The perfect smile. The thoughtful gestures. The effortless charm. It wasn't random. It was calculated. Because when someone wants to hide something big, they don't just bury the truth, they decorate the grave. At the time, though, I didn't see it. I didn't want to see it. I told myself I was lucky. I told myself I'd finally found someone who wouldn't hurt me. Someone I could trust completely, but the truth has a way of slipping through the cracks. It started small. The little things most people would ignore. A missed call here, a strange look there. Nights where he claimed he was working late, but his stories didn't always add up. At first, I brushed it off. I told myself I was being paranoid, overthinking, reading too much into nothing. Because isn't that what we all do when we don't want to face the truth? We explain away the evidence. We silence the voice in our head. But the inconsistencies kept piling up. Tiny threads unraveling from the edges of his perfect facade. There were times when I'd ask a simple question, "Where were you?" And his answer would come too quickly, too rehearsed, like he'd practiced it in his head before speaking. There were moments when he'd glance at his phone and then turn it over, screen down, as if I wasn't supposed to notice. And the strangest part? He was too perfect at everything else. Too attentive. Too charming. Too careful. As if he was overcompensating. As if he knew that if he let the act slip for even a second, I'd see the truth staring back at me. It was like standing in a beautiful house and noticing the faintest crack in the wall. At first, you ignore it. But over time, you realize the crack is growing, spreading, threatening to bring the whole house down. That's how it felt with him. The perfect illusion, slowly unraveling. I told myself to be patient. To wait. Because if there was one thing I was certain of, it was this: the truth always finds its way out. And when it did, I would be there. I would see the mask fall. And then I would decide what to do with the pieces. For now, I stayed quiet. I let him believe I was blind. I let him believe I was still caught in the spell he had so carefully cast. And as I smiled back at him, pretending to live in the perfect illusion, I made another promise to myself. When the truth finally came to light, I wouldn't just stand there in shock. I would be ready. Because some illusions aren't meant to be broken gently. Some need to shatter. Loudly. Completely. And deep in my heart, I knew the day was coming. The mask would fall. And when it did, everything would change. At first, it was just late nights. Work, he said. Always work. Deadlines, projects, emergencies that couldn't wait until morning. And I wanted to believe him. I really did. Because believing him meant believing in the life we'd built. Believing him meant I didn't have to face the gnawing fear in my gut. But the hours grew longer. The explanations thinner. And slowly, I began to wonder, was it really work? Or was it something else entirely? His phone became another battlefield of doubt. He used to leave it lying around carelessly on the counter, on the nightstand, on the passenger seat of his car. But one day, I noticed the change. Suddenly, it was glued to him. Always in his pocket. Always face down. Always locked with a new passcode I didn't know. The first time I asked, he laughed it off. Just security, he said. Work stuff. You know how it is. But I didn't know. I knew the difference between protecting information and hiding secrets. And secrets have a way of making themselves known, even when you're not looking for them. There were nights he came home smelling different. Not perfume, not something obvious. But different. Like a change in the air around him. The kind of difference you can't name, but you feel. And when I leaned in, searching for answers, he pulled away just slightly, just enough to make me notice. I asked questions. Not accusing. Not demanding. Just gentle, curious questions. And every time, his answers felt rehearsed. Too smooth. Too polished. As though he'd practiced them in his head before speaking aloud. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. I told myself trust was the foundation of everything we had. But trust doesn't mean ignoring your instincts. And my instincts were screaming. Still, I stayed quiet. I watched. I waited. Because sometimes silence says more than words ever could. One evening, I decided to surprise him. I cooked his favorite dinner, lit candles, set the table. I wanted to remind us both of the life we once had. But he never showed up. Hours passed, and every call I made went unanswered. Finally, close to midnight, he stumbled in with another excuse. Traffic. A client call. A meeting that ran late. And as he spoke, I looked into his eyes, and for the first time, I saw something I couldn't ignore. Fear. It was there, flickering just beneath the surface, quickly buried beneath another smile. But I saw it. I felt it. And that was the moment I knew something wasn't just wrong, it was unraveling. The near discoveries started piling up. A receipt in his pocket from a restaurant we'd never been to. A credit card charge for flowers I never received. Conversations half finished when I walked into the room. Each clue was small on its own. But together, they painted a picture I didn't want to see. Still, I clung to denial. Because once you admit the truth, you can't go back. And maybe a part of me wasn't ready to let go just yet. One night, though, denial was no longer an option. He left his jacket draped over the chair, his phone buzzing quietly in the pocket. Normally, he never left it unattended. But this time, he was in the shower. And for the first time in months, the opportunity was right there. My heart pounded as I pulled the phone out, staring at the glowing screen. A message preview blinked back at me. Just a name I didn't recognize, followed by words that made my stomach twist. I miss you already. That was all it said. But those 4 words were louder than any confession he could have given me. My hands shook as I locked the screen and placed the phone back, exactly where I'd found it. When he returned, towel around his shoulders, smiling like nothing had happened, I smiled back. But inside, something shifted. The illusion was gone. The cracks weren't cracks anymore. They were gaping holes. And now I had proof, even if it was only a glimpse. That night, I lay awake in silence, replaying every memory, every smile, every word he'd ever spoken. How much of it was real? How much of it was a lie? The questions circled endlessly in my head. How many lies can one person hide? How long can someone wear a mask before it finally slips? And when it does, what happens to the person left behind? The answers didn't come. But the decision did. I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. I couldn't live in his illusion one more day. Something inside me hardened that night. And though he had no idea, though he still thought I was blind, that was the moment my revenge began. He asked me how my night was. Just like that. As if nothing had happened. As if the foundation of my world hadn't just collapsed. And I answered. Calm. Steady. Because he didn't deserve the satisfaction of knowing I had found the truth. Not yet. That night, lying beside him, I listened to his breathing as he drifted off to sleep. Steady. Rhythmic. Peaceful. As though he carried no guilt at all. Meanwhile, my heartbeat thundered in my chest. My mind replayed the words I had read. The images of him with her. The betrayal. Sadness washed over me first, heavy, suffocating. Like mourning something that was already dead. Because that's what our relationship had become, a corpse, dressed up to look alive. Then came anger. Hot, sharp, relentless. Anger at him for lying. Anger at myself for believing. Anger at every moment I wasted holding on to a man who had already let go of me. And finally, disbelief. How could he? How could someone who looked me in the eyes, who held me close, who promised me forever, also promise someone else the same? It was more than betrayal. It was erasure. Every moment we had shared felt rewritten, poisoned by his lies. I turned on my side, staring at him in the dark. His face looked so peaceful, so innocent. But I knew the truth now. And knowing changes everything. I realized then that I had 2 choices. I could break down, confront him, and let the chaos swallow me. Or I could stay silent. And silence, I realized, was stronger. Because silence meant power. Silence meant control. Silence meant revenge. So I stayed still. I stayed calm. And I began to plan. The next morning, I pretended nothing had happened. I smiled. I kissed him goodbye. And when he walked out the door, I sat down in the empty house and let the tears finally fall. They came in waves, grief for the love I thought I had, pain for the trust he destroyed, rage for the betrayal he thought he could hide. But when the tears ended, something else remained. Determination. Because betrayal may break you for a moment, but it also gives you clarity. And I saw everything clearly now. His patterns. His habits. His weaknesses. The very lies he used to manipulate me would soon become the very threads I would pull to unravel him. After that night, everything I did had two layers. On the surface, I smiled. I went to work. I answered his texts with the same casual warmth I always had. I laughed at his jokes. I made coffee like nothing had happened. I folded his shirts. I carried on a life that looked ordinary, even happy to anyone watching. But underneath that ordinary life, something else was growing. A plan. Quiet. Patient. Precise. He asked me how my night was. Just like that. As if nothing had happened. As if the foundation of my world hadn't just collapsed. And I answered. Calm. Steady. Because he didn't deserve the satisfaction of knowing I had found the truth. Not yet. That night, lying beside him, I listened to his breathing as he drifted off to sleep. Steady. Rhythmic. Peaceful. As though he carried no guilt at all. Meanwhile, my heartbeat thundered in my chest. My mind replayed the words I had read. The images of him with her. The betrayal. Sadness washed over me first, heavy, suffocating. Like mourning something that was already dead. Because that's what our relationship had become, a corpse, dressed up to look alive. Then came anger. Hot, sharp, relentless. Anger at him for lying. Anger at myself for believing. Anger at every moment I wasted holding on to a man who had already let go of me. And finally, disbelief. How could he? How could someone who looked me in the eyes, who held me close, who promised me forever, also promise someone else the same? It was more than betrayal. It was erasure. Every moment we had shared felt rewritten, poisoned by his lies. I turned on my side, staring at him in the dark. His face looked so peaceful, so innocent. But I knew the truth now. And knowing changes everything. I realized then that I had two choices. I could break down, confront him, and let the chaos swallow me. Or I could stay silent. And silence, I realized, was stronger. Because silence meant power. Silence meant control. Silence meant revenge. So I stayed still. I stayed calm. And I began to plan. The next morning, I pretended nothing had happened. I smiled. I kissed him goodbye. And when he walked out the door, I sat down in the empty house and let the tears finally fall. They came in waves, grief for the love I thought I had, pain for the trust he destroyed, rage for the betrayal he thought he could hide. But when the tears ended, something else remained. Determination. Because betrayal may break you for a moment, but it also gives you clarity. And I saw everything clearly now. His patterns. His habits. His weaknesses. The very lies he used to manipulate me would soon become the very threads I would pull to unravel him. After that night, everything I did had two layers. On the surface, I smiled. I went to work. I answered his texts with the same casual warmth I always had. I laughed at his jokes. I made coffee like nothing had happened. I folded his shirts. I carried on a life that looked ordinary, even happy to anyone watching. But underneath that ordinary life, something else was growing. A plan. Quiet. Patient. Precise. Revenge, I decided, would not be a spectacle. It would be surgical. It would be the kind of punishment that doesn't beg for attention. It just takes what you once had and removes it, piece by piece, until there's nothing left to pretend with. And so I began. I started by watching. Not in an obsessive, frantic way, but like a scientist watching a subject, taking careful notes. I paid attention to routines. To small gestures. To the safety nets he'd built around his secrets. He had patterns. Little habits that made him predictable. He always locked his office door at 9 p.m., even when he was home. He always answered his mother's calls within 2 rings. He always left his charger plugged into the living room outlet when he went out. He always boasted about his trustworthy circle of friends. These patterns were my map. Some nights I sat on the couch pretending to read, while really watching him move through the apartment. I watched how he tucked his phone into the little inner pocket of his jacket. I watched how he would check his car before driving off, as if making sure no one followed. Ordinary actions, but they gave me the clues I needed. Next came evidence. I knew the world demands proof, not feelings. I needed tangible things that would expose him in a way words alone never could. So I collected. Quietly. Carefully. Ethically, not by breaking into accounts or stealing, but by paying attention to what he left behind. A receipt folded into a jacket he was done with, a hotel name half-typed into an old email draft, a voicemail lodged in an old voicemail folder, a calendar invite he forgot to delete. I kept a notebook. Call it old-fashioned if you want. To me, it was a ledger of truth. Each entry was a little victory against the fog of doubt I'd lived in for months. I dated them, cross-checked them, compared times. He had lied so often that inconsistency became obvious when you tracked everything. Sometimes the proof was small, a lipstick stain on a sweater he claimed he'd never worn in public. Sometimes it was bigger, a line of messages saved under an obscure contact name. Each discovery was a pin on the map, a piece of a puzzle that formed a picture I now recognized. And with each new piece of evidence, my plan sharpened. I also learned patience. Patience became my weapon. Because the best trap is the one the other person walks into willingly, convinced they are still in control. I could have confronted him. I could have spilled the truth and watched his world burn in front of me. But I knew that burning would be noisy and fleeting. I wanted something cleaner. Permanent. So I waited. I waited for the right moment when his guard would be down, when his allies would be listening to him, when his reputation was at its highest and he felt untouchable. People always reveal themselves when they feel safest. That's when mistakes happen, and mistakes would be my way in. Each day, I played my part on the surface. I posted photos with him, the smiles carefully curated. I replied to friends' messages about how we were doing. I showed up at parties, pretending to be the supportive partner. I let people continue to see what he wanted them to see, a happy couple. No one suspected anything. And that was perfect. But living two lives is a strange thing. Some days I felt like an actor in my own life. My chest would tighten when he hugged me in public, knowing the tenderness was a performance on his part. My hands would shake when he praised me at a dinner with colleagues. The smile I wore felt like borrowed armor. And still I smiled. Because smiles are tools too. A well-timed smile disarms suspicion. People dislike the idea that darkness could exist behind a warm face. So I used their assumptions against him. At the same time, I set small mechanical moves in motion. I scheduled meetings when I knew he'd be out. I left gentle but leading questions in the messages I saved, planting doubts that would grow into real consequences later. I nudged friends into casual conversations about loyalty and truth, not in a way that seemed obvious, but just enough to let seeds be planted. There were moments of doubt. Would he see it coming? Would he realize before it was too late? I asked myself that question at night, lying awake while his breathing filled the apartment. Sometimes I imagined him waking up and reading a message that would unravel his entire carefully constructed life. Sometimes I imagined him looking at me, eyes wild, begging for an explanation. Other times, I imagined nothing at all, just the cold realization that his life had quietly slipped through his fingers. Would he see it coming? Would he even care if he did? These questions haunted me, but they didn't stop me. They refined the edges of my plan. Part of my strategy was exposing him where it mattered, not with a public spectacle for strangers, but in private where his most important people would feel the real blow. Reputation is often a currency, and it's easiest to tarnish among peers who value trust. If he had lied to me, surely he'd lied to others too. I started quietly reaching out to people who had hinted at frustration with him in the past, casually asking about their experiences. I didn't lead, just listened. I also secured backups. I saved documents, emails, photos, everything that corroborated what I'd discovered. I made copies. I organized a timeline. If I needed to present this truth to anyone, a friend, his family, or even his employer, I wanted it to be undeniable. There was a moral side to my plan too. I didn't want to ruin for the sake of ruining. My objective wasn't to humiliate for sport. It was to strip away the safety his lies had given him. To make sure he could no longer step back into a life of lies and comfort. In the end, I wanted him to understand the scale of what he'd done, to face consequences that matched the quiet cruelty of his betrayal. The plot thickened when I found out he was due to travel out of town for a week, an event that would give me both risk and opportunity. On one hand, his absence meant fewer immediate reactions, and I had to move carefully. On the other, it meant a chance to set things in motion without him constantly checking his phone. I marked that date on my calendar. The countdown began. In the weeks leading up to his trip, I tightened my watch on him. I let him believe the status quo continued. I smiled at the dinner table when he checked his watch. I kissed him on the cheek when he left. Then I locked the door and returned to the ledger. Sometimes revenge is logistical. It's about timing, staging, and paying attention to the little things. It's about making the ordinary moment, a message, a mail delivery, an office conversation, do all the work for you. So I arranged for the right people to be where they needed to be at the right time. I made careful phone calls and sent casual messages that would later be used as anchors in the story of his unraveling. There were nights when I almost backed down. The kind of nights when the loneliness felt like an ocean and the moral questions crowded my mind. Was this who I wanted to be? Was this what justice looked like? I reminded myself why I had started. It wasn't anger alone. It was the betrayal that had rewritten my life without my consent. It was the quiet death of trust. I owed it to myself to respond with intention, not chaos. So I kept going. Calm. Calculated. Silent. I rehearsed my reactions. I planned what I'd say if confronted. I built contingencies. I imagined every possible outcome and prepared for it. The plan was no longer abstract. It had shape, deadlines, and a cold clarity. As the departure day drew near, the tension in me thrummed like a wire about to snap. Would he see it coming? Would he notice the careful way I'd arranged for truths to meet the people who needed to know them? Would he recognize the map I'd laid out, the trail of breadcrumbs leading straight to him? I didn't know. And that uncertainty was both terrifying and intoxicating. But one thing was certain, I was no longer the person who would sit and be fooled. I had traded despair for strategy. I had turned pain into a plan, and now I would see it through. The final step was simple and terrifying. Wait for the opening, then pull the thread. When the unraveling began, there would be no spectacle, no shouting, only a silence so complete it would echo through the hollow he had made of our life. And in that silence, he would finally hear the truth. Would he see it coming? That was the last question I allowed myself before the day he left. The rest I kept to the ledger, to the plans, and to the quiet, steady heartbeat of someone who had decided to reclaim what had been taken. When the week he left finally arrived, I felt a strange calm. The timing wasn't accidental, it was everything. His absence gave me the space I needed to let the plan move on its own, to become an invisible hand that pulled at threads until the whole thing unraveled. I watched him pack his bag with the same steady hands that had once packed mine. He kissed me with a practiced tenderness, told me to be safe, to take care of myself. He left with promises in his voice and a suitcase full of other promises he'd made to another person. I waved until his car disappeared around the corner, then closed the door and listened to the echo of silence settle in the apartment. That silence was my signal. The first step was exposure, small and precise. I started with people who stood between him and the truth, those who could unknowingly protect him because they believed the version of him he showed to the world. I reached out with neutral questions, casual and careful. Have you ever noticed anything odd about him? Did he ever say he was with you when he wasn't? No accusations, no dramatics, just gentle prompts that let others fill in blanks I already knew existed. Conversations began to line up like dominoes. A coworker mentioned a late business lunch that never made it into any report. A friend recalled a weekend he'd described differently than the social posts suggested. I listened, took notes, and quietly collected corroborations. Then I moved to the anchors of his life. I sent selected emails, copies of the messages I'd found, the receipts, the timelines to a few key people who would take them seriously. Not a mass share, not a scene. I targeted those who had influence over him, a trusted colleague, someone in his family who always believed in doing the right thing, and one mutual friend who could no longer pretend they didn't notice. Each message was framed as concern, as a whisper. I think you should know this. The reactions were subtle at first. A withdrawn text. A meeting canceled. An uncomfortable silence in a place where there used to be laughter. But silence can be loud when it follows a truth. Next, I hit where it would hurt most, his reputation at work. I sent a carefully organized file to HR, not accusatory, not dramatic, simply a timeline with supporting evidence that suggested a pattern of deceit. I explained the impact his double life could have on the team, on clients, on trust. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I just presented facts. Facts are difficult to argue against. It was surgical. An internal review began. Meetings happened without his knowledge. I watched from my phone at the kitchen table as confirmations came in. Someone had flagged an anomaly in billing. A client had complained about missed deliverables during his supposed business trips. The house of cards he'd built in one area started to wobble in another. He called more frequently, nervously, while he was away. His voice had an edge to it, a small echo of panic that he tried to cover with jokes. I listened, answered calmly, and let him think he still had control. Because control is a dangerous illusion, once it slips, it's nearly impossible to regain. Social circles began to shift too. People who had once laughed with him now made awkward excuses. Invitations thinned. Messages went unanswered. He would show up at gatherings expecting applause, and instead he found quiet nods, polite distances, eyes that lingered a moment too long on a phone screen. I watched as his smile faltered, as the confident rhythm he'd always relied on started to skip. It was amazing how quickly support can evaporate when doubts are seated. Friends who'd once defended him now asked pointed questions. Family members who'd once brushed off rumors began to hold conversations behind closed doors. His allies were not unbreakable, they were human, and humans respond to evidence. I also used the small, seemingly mundane channels that people forget exist, the things they assume are private but are actually public in subtle ways. I arranged for a message to reach someone important in his life at the exact time he was most vulnerable, a forwarded copy of a thread, an old voicemail uploaded to a shared drive, a bank alert screenshot. Nothing flashy. Nothing illegal. Just the truth placed where it would be seen. One by one, doors closed around him. The person who had once relied on charm and a well-polished story found himself increasingly isolated. Calls that once ended in laughter now ended abruptly. The colleagues who had praised him at meetings now avoided being alone with him. Where he expected refuge, he found distance. The most devastating moves were the quietest. I didn't need to scream his secrets on social media. I didn't need to create a spectacle. Instead, I dismantled the scaffolding of his life, the small supports that made him feel safe. I took away his deniability by replacing it with proof. I showed the people he respected the same documents he'd trusted would never be seen by them. I let the consequences roll in naturally, like a storm gathering and finally breaking. There was a point when the shock in his voice during a call became unmistakable. He stopped pretending to be smooth. He no longer joked his way out of questions. His sentences broke. He started asking for explanations from me, from friends, from colleagues. But the explanations didn't come from me. They came from emails, from receipts, from timelines I'd quietly handed over. He began to realize he had no story left that matched the one people had been shown. His narratives unraveled under the weight of evidence. People began to test him with quiet questions, the kind meant to catch you in a lie. Where were you on this date? Who did you meet at this event? He fumbled. He guessed. His answers didn't hold. And then came the calls from people I knew would matter most, his sister, his closest friend from childhood. They were careful at first, measured, polite, until one by one the disbelief turned to a hollow silence and then to anger. I overheard one conversation when I answered a call he didn't expect me to, his sister's voice, trembling. "How could you?" she asked him. He stammered. He tried to explain. But this time, explanations were responses to evidence, not simply denials. He started to lose the places where he could hide. The office that once respected him questioned his integrity. The friends who had turned a blind eye now asked why they had been deceived. His family's trust, perhaps the hardest to break, wavered. And once family begins to doubt, it echoes differently. It carries weight. The climax wasn't a single dramatic moment. It was a collapse that sounded small but felt enormous. A resignation from a position he valued. A pulled request for a weekend he'd planned. A message thread he could not explain. A reputation that once opened doors now quietly closed them. Each loss was a quiet death of a piece of the life he'd built. I watched it happen with my hands unclenched. I felt no joy in the destruction. The pain that had led me here was real, and so was the sorrow of watching someone who had once mattered fall apart. But I also felt a fierce sense of justice. The man who had sown secrets and comforted himself with lies was now confronted by the very thing he had used to comfort himself, other people's belief. In the middle of it all, I remember one scene clearly, him at his kitchen table, phone glowing, messages open, the hard lines of his face exposed in the cold light. He looked small there, not the confident man who once walked around like he owned everything. He ran his hands through his hair and closed his eyes like he'd been punched. For the first time, he did not know what to say. For the first time, his rehearsed responses failed him. And then the realization hit him like a physical force. He looked up at me, not with the old smile, but with something raw and naked. Panic, regret, and a dawning horror. The betrayal he had given was now the betrayal he received. He had taught me how to hide and lie. I had learned how to reveal. He had thought himself untouchable. He had been wrong. When the dust finally settled, there was no explosion, no dramatic finale. Just silence. The silence of phones that no longer rang for him. The silence of friends who once laughed at his jokes, but now avoided his eyes. The silence of doors closing softly, one after another, as the truth seeped into every corner of his carefully crafted life. He was still standing, technically. He still had a roof over his head, still had a job title, still had a phone filled with contacts. But the weight of betrayal doesn't destroy in one loud strike. It erodes, day by day, like water against stone. His colleagues no longer trusted his words. Meetings grew colder, conversations clipped. People who once leaned on him for advice now spoke around him, not to him. I heard he lost a project he'd been chasing for years, the kind of opportunity he used to brag about at dinner. His friends? They drifted away in waves. Some left quickly, disgust plain in their silence. Others lingered for a while, torn between history and truth, before eventually stepping back too. Loyalty, once his shield, was gone. He stood in the crowd, but no one stood with him. Even his family, the last fortress he believed unshakable, had cracks now. His sister, who had once defended him fiercely, refused to take his calls. His parents, who once boasted about his achievements, grew quiet when his name came up. He was no longer the son, the brother, the pride. He was the question mark, the disappointment, the one whose story people lowered their voices to whisper about. Isolation had found him. And this time, no story, no smile, no practice charm could make it leave. And me? I didn't gloat. I didn't cheer. I didn't need to. Because revenge doesn't always mean fire and noise. Sometimes, it's the steady quiet after a storm, the stillness that reminds you the world has changed, and there's no going back. I had given him exactly what he gave me, silence. The silence of trust broken, of certainty destroyed. The silence of knowing the person you thought you could rely on was never real at all. But here's the difference. His silence was born of lies. Mine was born of truth. I carried no shame, no guilt. I had no reason to look away in a mirror. What I did was not cruel for cruelty's sake. It was not reckless. It was deliberate. It was justice, quiet, measured, undeniable justice. Sometimes I wondered if he thought of me during those long nights when his phone lit up with unanswered calls. Did he imagine me laughing somewhere, celebrating? Did he curse me, blame me, hate me? Maybe. Probably. But the truth is, I wasn't thinking of him at all. I was thinking of myself, of the person I had become, of the strength I'd found in silence, of the lessons carved into me by betrayal. The day I finally walked away, it wasn't dramatic. I didn't slam the door. I didn't deliver a final speech or a list of grievances. I didn't need to. I simply packed my bag, zipped it shut, and left. He was there, sitting at the table, eyes hollow, hands restless like he wanted to reach out but didn't know how. He opened his mouth, but no words came. And I just looked at him one last time, not with anger, not with pity. Just clarity. Because what more could be said? What words could ever repair the cracks he'd carved into both of us? None. So I gave him the same thing I'd promised from the beginning. Silence. And then I walked out. Now, when I look back, I don't see a broken story. I see a lesson. I learned that betrayal can shatter, but it can also sharpen. It taught me to trust my instincts, to listen when something inside me whispered something isn't right. It taught me that silence can be louder than shouting, that patience can be more powerful than rage. Most of all, it taught me this: when someone shows you who they truly are, believe them. Don't wait for the mask to fall. Don't ignore the shadows creeping in. He thought betrayal would leave me broken. But it didn't. It left me stronger. It left me clearer. It left me unshaken. And as for him, he's still living in the silence he created, the silence that grew louder when my footsteps faded from his life. That was my revenge. Not chaos. Not destruction. Just truth. And sometimes, truth is the loudest sound of all. Lies can last for years. They can hide in smiles, in warm touches, in the reassuring cadence of familiar words. They weave themselves into daily routines, masquerading as love, loyalty, and trust. And for a while, they succeed. They convince us that everything is fine, that doubt is foolish, that suspicion is nothing but paranoia. But the truth is patient. It doesn't rush, it doesn't falter. It waits. It waits for a slip of the tongue, for a forgotten detail, for a clue too small to notice until the moment it suddenly glows like a flare in the night. The truth doesn't need to be chased. It will come unrelenting no matter how deep someone tries to bury it. And when it does, it is heavier than all the lies combined. Betrayal is not just about the act itself. It's about the destruction of the foundation. When someone betrays you, they don't just wound your heart, they shatter your sense of safety, your faith in your own perception of reality. The real cruelty of betrayal is the way it makes you doubt yourself. Was I blind? Was I foolish? Was I too trusting? Those questions linger, replaying in the silence of your thoughts. But eventually, you realize the betrayal doesn't define you. It defines them. They chose deceit. They chose manipulation. They chose to gamble with trust, believing it would never run out. But trust is not infinite. And once it breaks, it doesn't repair. People imagine revenge as fire, as chaos, as destruction so loud the world trembles. But that's the fantasy. Real revenge, the kind that lasts, the kind that cuts the deepest, is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't scream. It doesn't even always look like revenge. It is the silence after you walk away. It is the absence of your loyalty, your laughter, your support. It is the void they are left with when they realize that all the things they took for granted are gone, and they cannot get them back. Silence is powerful because it cannot be argued with. There are no words to twist, no explanations to manipulate. It is final. It is absolute. That silence was my revenge. Walking away isn't weakness. Walking away is strength, the kind of strength that comes from knowing you don't need to fight for someone who already betrayed you. When you scream, they hear anger. When you cry, they see pain. But when you walk away in silence, they see nothing, and in that nothing, their imagination becomes their punishment. They wonder what you know. They wonder what you think. They wonder what you'll do next. And the truth is, you'll do nothing. Because the most devastating punishment for a betrayer is realizing they no longer matter. I learned something in all of this. Revenge is not about destroying someone else. It's about reclaiming yourself. For so long, his lies made me doubt my instincts, question my worth, silence my voice. But when the truth came, and when I finally acted, I found something I hadn't realized I'd lost: my own power. He thought his betrayal would weaken me. But it strengthened me. He thought I'd be broken. But I rebuilt myself. He thought I'd beg for answers. But I left him with silence. And in that silence, I found peace. He thought I'd never find out. But I did. And when I left, I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply walked away. And that silence became the sound of my revenge.